Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon to our lovely lecturer, Miss Jamhira, and everyone. Today we will be presenting about liberalism in international relations. My name is Nur Fariza Fakiha, and together with my group members Nur Natasha, Amir Rauda, Alia Maisara, and Hari Razin, we are from Group 3. So without further ado, let us begin our presentation. I would like to pass the presentation to the next presenter.
Assalamualaikum. Hi everyone, my name is Hari Razin Nijam. Before we dive into the detail, let me start with a quick introduction to our topic for today, which is liberalism in international relations. So what is liberalism? So in simple terms, liberalism is a theory of international relations that believes countries can cooperate peacefully instead of always fighting and competing. Here is what liberalism believes. First, democracy promotes a peace. So liberal thinkers argue that democratic countries rarely fight each other because leaders can accountable to voters who don't like a war. Second, economic independence makes war costly. When countries trade a lot, they become dependent on each other. Fighting will destroy the trade, so they choose negotiation instead. Third, international institutions like the UN, WTO, and ASEAN matter. So they provide rules, monitoring, and a place for countries to talk. So they reduce fear and make cooperation possible. Fourth, individuals and non-actors like NGOs and corporations also shape the world politics. It's not just about the government. So, the core idea of liberalism is cooperation is possible, peace is achievable, and we can design the system, democracy, trade institution to make that happen. So that is the general idea about liberalism. Now, let me give you a quick history of how liberalism developed. In 18th century, which is the beginning, the most important early thinker is Immanuel Kant, a Germanese philosopher in 1795. He wrote an essay called A Perpetual Peace. His argument was groundbreaking. He said the lasting peace is possible if three things happen. First, country becomes republics, what we call now democracies. Second, they create a federation of nations, like the UN later. And third, they allow free trade and travel. So, Kant believed that the war is not inevitable. Humans can reason and create peaceful system. Second, a 19th century, which is the spreading liberal ideas. During the 1800s, liberal ideas influenced the free trade movement. Thinkers like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill argued that economic exchange between nations reduce hostility, so the countries can start signing trade and agreements. Third, early 20th century, after World War I. So after the devastation of World War I, US President Woodrow Wilson pushed for a new international organization, which is the League of Nations. He believed that if countries had a place to talk and make rules, they could avoid another world war. Unfortunately, the League failed to prevent a World War II, but the idea didn't die. Fourth, the post-World War II, the golden age of liberalism. So after World War II, countries tried again. They created a United Nations in 1945, the World Trade Organization, originally GATT, in 1947, and later the European Union. So these are the liberal institutions designed to promote cooperation, trade, and democracy. And for over 70 years, major war between great powers has been avoided. So liberals say that's not an accident. And today, liberalism continues to explain many things in the world politics, like why ASEAN work, why Malaysia prefers negotiation with China over confrontation, and why the countries use WTO to settle trade disputes instead of fighting.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Fariza Fakiha binti Zahadi. So today, I would like to explain the three main principles of liberalism in international relations. So the first principle is cooperation and peace between states. Liberalism believes that countries can cooperate with each other instead of using war to solve conflicts. Through diplomacy, discussion, and agreement, states are able to maintain peace and stability in the international system. Liberalists believe that cooperation can give more benefit compared to conflict because war can cause destruction and instability. One example is the United Nations. The United Nations was established to help countries solve international disputes peacefully through negotiation and diplomacy. So the main idea of this principle is that cooperation can reduce conflict and create peace among countries. The second principle is economic interdependence. This principle means that countries depend on each other economically through trade, investment, and business relations. Liberalism believes that when countries are economically connected, they are less likely to go to war because conflict will harm their economies. For example, even during the 2018 trade war, US and China still rely heavily on each other economically. Both countries continue trading because their businesses and industry benefited from their relationship. Therefore, liberalists believe that strong economic ties can encourage peaceful international relations. The third principle is democracy and individual freedom. Liberalism supports democratic system, human rights, and freedom of speech. Liberalists believe that democratic countries are more peaceful because governments are accountable to the people. In democratic countries, citizens are participate in politics and express their opinion freely. Because of this, governments are usually more careful before engaged in war or conflict. Examples of democratic countries include Canada and United Kingdom, which practice peaceful diplomacy and democratic governance. So, liberalism believes that democracy helps create stability and peaceful solution. In conclusion, the three main principles of liberalism are cooperation and peace between states, economic interdependence, and democracy and individual freedom. Overall, liberalism has an optimistic view of international relations because it believes peace and stability can be achieved through cooperation, trade, and democratic value rather than military power alone. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum and good afternoon everyone. My name is Alaman Sarah, and for my part, I will be explaining the role of institution in liberalism theory in international relations. So, according to liberalism, institutions are very important because they help countries cooperate peacefully instead of using war of military power. Liberalists believe that countries can solve problems through discussion, diplomacy, and cooperation. In simple words, institutions act as a platform for countries to communicate, negotiate, and maintain good international relationships. Now, we look at the first one. One of the main roles of institutions is promoting peace and security. Institutions encourage countries to solve conflict peacefully through negotiation and discussion instead of fighting with each other. They also help reduce tension between countries and support peacekeeping efforts to maintain international stability. For example, the United Nations, or we known as UN, plays an important role in maintaining peace around the world. The United Nations help countries discuss issues peacefully through diplomatic meetings and conflict resolution. It also conducts peacekeeping missions in countries experiencing conflict. This clearly showed that liberalism believes cooperation and communication are important in maintaining global peace. Besides that, institutions also encourage economic cooperation among countries. Liberalism believes that countries can build stronger relationships through trade and economic activities. Institutions help promote free and fair trade and strengthen economic relationships between countries. One example is the World Trade Organization, or we known as WTO. World Trade Organization regulates global trade and create trade rules for countries to follow. It also helps countries solve trade disputes peacefully. Through trade cooperation, countries become economically connected, and because of that, conflicts are less likely to happen since war can negatively affect their economic and business. Next, institutions also play an important role in strengthening regional cooperation. Regional institutions help countries in the same region cooperate in areas such as economic, politics, security, and social development. These institutions also help countries solve regional issues together in a peaceful way. For example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also we known as ASEAN, promote peaceful relations and cooperation among Southeast Asian countries. ASEAN member countries work together in trade, tourism, education, and regional security. Through ASEAN, meeting and discussion, countries are able to maintain stability and strengthen relationships within the region. Last but not least, institutions also establish rules and norms in international relations. Institutions create international law, agreements, and standards that guide the behavior of countries. This will help reduce misunderstandings and make international relations more organized and stable. For example, the United Nations promote international agreement and global standards in areas such as human rights and international security. This helps countries cooperate more effectively and maintain stable international relationships. Overall, liberalism believes that institutions are very important because they promote peace, cooperation, economic development, and stability among countries. Through institutions, countries are able to communicate, negotiate, and solve problems peacefully instead of using conflict and war. That's all from me. I will pass to the next presenter. Thank you.
Now, we're going to analyze how liberalism actually works in international relations. So I'm going to explain the step-by-step logic, the cause and effect that liberalism used to explain why countries cooperate. And I'll give you the real example from Malaysia so you can see it in actions. So mechanism number 1, domestic regimes type shapes of foreign policies. So here's how the logic works step by step. First, in a democracy, leaders are elected by the people. Second, ordinary citizens, which is the voters, are the ones who pay the cost of war, higher taxes, lost jobs, and the worst soldier life. So third, voters don't like war unless it's absolutely necessary. Fourth, because the leaders want to get re-elected, they will avoid starting wars. Fifth, when two democracies interact, both sides act this way, so they end up using diplomacy, not violence. Now you might say, but Malaysia isn't a full democracy. You're right, but liberalism still helps us to understand the Malaysia choices. Look at the Malaysia relationship with established democracies like Japan, South Korea, and Germany. For decades, Malaysia has focused on trade, technology, and education with these countries. For example, the Look East policy. There's no military confrontation. Why? Because the Malaysia domestic priority is economic and development and stability. That shapes its foreign policies to be cooperative, not aggressive. So, mechanism 1 is what happened inside a country affect how it behaves outside. Mechanism 2, economic interdependence restructure initiative. Again, let me walk you through the step-by-step logic. So, step 1, countries specialize in different industries. One make electronics, another grows palm oil, another produce machinery. So, step 2, they build a long-term relationship, factories, supply chains, contracts. So these are the hard to move or replace. Economists call them asset-specific investment. Step 3, over time, both economies become deeply connected. So companies, workers, and consumers on both sides benefits. Step 4, if war breaks out, all of that is destroyed. Factories close, jobs disappear, supply chains collapse. Step 5, so the cost of war becomes much higher than any possible benefit from fighting. So therefore, the leaders choose negotiation instead of going to war. So here's the real Malaysian example. So China is Malaysia's largest trading partner, over 100 billion US dollars every year. Malaysia sells palm oil, electronics, and petroleum. China sells manufactured goods and machinery. So now, Malaysia and China have a disagreement, especially in the South China Sea. But have they gone to war? No. They keep talking, but they kept talking. Why? Because the war will destroy that $100 billion relationship. That just stupid for the both sides. So mechanism 2 is trade makes war expensive, so peace becomes irrational. So mechanism 3, international institutions solve two big problems, which is information and commitment. So this one is a little more abstract, so listen closely. So in international relations, there's no world government. So how can countries trust each other? So realists say they can. Everyone will cheat. So liberalism says institution can fix this. Let me explain two problems and two solutions. So the problem 1 is information. So you don't know if the other side is cheating on an agreement. So the solution is monitoring. So institutions like the UN send inspector, the WTO publisher trade data. So now everyone can see what's happening. Problem 2, commitment. So you promise to cooperate, but how do you know they won't break their promise? So the solution is enforcement. So institutions like WTO can authorize sanctions against cheaters. That's a real punishment. Now, for a Malaysian example, in 2019, the European Union restricted the palm oil imports from Malaysia, claiming it caused deforestation. Malaysia could have retaliate, start a trade war, but instead Malaysia filed a formal complaint to the World Trade Organization. Why? Because Malaysia trusts the WTO process. So the institution will review the evidence and make a ruling, and both sides agreed to follow the rules. So the mechanism 3 is institution reduce uncertainty, so the cooperation is no longer risky. So mechanism 4, iterations or repeated interaction creates reciprocity. So this one is about time. Let me explain. Imagine how you meet a stranger once. You might cheat them because you never see them again. So that's the one-shot game. But if you meet the same person again and again, at schools, at work, or in your neighborhood, you won't cheat. Why? Because your reputation matters. If you cheat today, they punish you tomorrow. So that's the logic. So in international relations, Countries meet constantly. Think about ASEAN. So Malaysia meets its neighbor every year at summits. Officials meet monthly on specific issues. So take Malaysia and Singapore. They talk about the water, airspace, trade all the time. If Malaysia cheats on one agreement, Singapore will remember next time. So both sides cooperate. Not because they are friends, because they have a long future of interaction ahead. So mechanism 4 is when countries meet often, cooperation becomes a habit and defection hurts their future. So, liberalism does not assume that countries are kind or peaceful by nature. Instead, it shows how incentive can be structured through democracy, trade, institution, and repetition, so that cooperation becomes the rational, self-interested choice. So, that's how liberalism works. So, thank you. Next, my colleague will talk about the strength and weakness.
Good afternoon everyone, my name is N4AM2384G. So today I will explain the advantages and disadvantages of liberalism in international relations, also known as IR. Liberalism is a theory that focuses on cooperation, democracy, economic relations, and human rights in creating a peaceful international system. First, let's look at the advantages of the liberalism. The first advantages is that liberalism promotes international cooperation and stability. Liberalists believe that countries can work together through international organizations such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organizations. These organizations help countries discuss issues peacefully, reduce misunderstandings, and solve conflict through negotiations instead of war. Okay, so for the examples is the United Nations has carried out peacekeeping missions in countries experiencing conflict, such as South Sudan. These missions help reduce violence and encourage peace talks. This shows that cooperation between countries can help maintain global stability. Okay, move to the second advantage is economic interdependence, also called commercial liberalism. Liberalism argues that when countries trade with each other and depend on one another economically, they are less likely to go to the war because conflict would damage their economies. So for the examples, the United States and China have strong trade relationship. Even though they have a political tensions, but both countries continue to cooperate economically because their economies are interconnected. War would cause major financial losses for both sides. The third advantage is democratic peace theory. Liberalism believes that democratic countries rarely go to war with each other because they share values such as compromise, transparency, and respect for public opinion. Leaders in democratic countries also need support from citizens who usually do not want war because of its high cost. Okay, so the good examples is the relationship between France and Germany. In the past, these countries fought many wars, but after becoming democracies and cooperating through the European Union, they become close partners and maintain peaceful relations. And the final advantage here, we can see that liberalism emphasizes human rights and the roles of non-state actors. Liberalism recognizes the importance of NGOs, multinationally, companies and individuals in global politics. It supports the protections of human rights around the world. For example, we can see here is Amnesty International campaigns against human rights abuse such as torture and unfair imprisonment. These organizations help pressure governments to protect human rights and improve justice. Okay, so next I will move to the disadvantage and criticisms of liberalism. The first criticism is that liberalism is overly idealistic and naive. Critics, especially realists, argue that liberalism assumes countries will always cooperate peacefully, but in reality, states mainly care about power and national interests. Powerful countries may ignore international law when it benefits them. For example, here, during the 2003 invasions of Iraq, the United States invaded Iraq despite opposition from the United Nations and several countries. This shows that powerful states may act based on their own interests rather than international cooperation. The second criticism is weak enforcement mechanism. International organizations often lack strong power to force countries to follow international law. There is no global governments or world police to punish countries effectively. For example, here is during the Russian invasions of Ukraine, the United Nations condemned the invasions but could not stop the conflict directly. This demonstrates the limitations of the international organization when facing powerful countries. Okay, so here is the third criticism, is that economic interdependence does not always create peace. Critics argue that economic competition can also increase tension between countries. States may compete for resource, technologies, and global influence. For example, the trade rivalry between the United States and China shows that even countries with strong economic ties can still experience serious political and economic tension. So the last criticism is Western bias or cultural imperialism. Some critics believe liberalism promotes Western values such as democracy and free markets while ignoring the cultural differences of other societies. This can create resistance and instability. For example, after 2001, Western countries tried to introduce democracy and liberal system in Afghanistan. However, this effort faced many challenges due to the cultural and political difference, leading to long-term instability. So here I can be conclude that liberalism has many strengths because it encourages cooperation, democracy, trade and human rights. However, it also has weaknesses because international politics is often influenced by power, conflict and national interests. Therefore, liberalism is important in understanding global relations, but it cannot fully explain every situation in international politics. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Andre Lauda and today I will explain the comparison between liberalism and Marxism by discussing their meaning, strength, weaknesses and example. First, liberalism is a theory that believes cooperation, freedom, democracy that can help countries achieve peace and progress. Liberalists believe countries can work together through international organizations and diplomacy instead of war. Meanwhile, Marxism is a theory introduced by Karl Marx that focuses on inequality between the rich and the working class. Marxists believe capitalism allows wealthy people and powerful countries to control resources while workers receive fewer benefits. For example, factory workers may work long hours for low wages while company owners gain huge profits. Now, let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of liberalism. The first strength is economic success and appeal. It means liberalism is attractive because many liberal countries experience economic growth and modernization. Free market system encourage business competition and innovation. For example, countries like US and Japan became economically powerful through capitalism and free trade. The second strength is provide a model for economic cooperation. Liberalism encourages countries to cooperate through trade and international organizations. This cooperation can strengthen relationship and reduce conflict. For example, countries in the European Union trade freely with each other, which improves their economies and cooperation. The third strength is gain global influence after the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, many countries adopted democracy and capitalist system, making liberalism more influential worldwide. For example, Eastern European countries such as Poland shifted towards democracy and market economies after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, liberalism also has weaknesses. The first weakness is cultural imperialism and imposition of values. This means liberalism is sometimes criticized for spreading Western culture and values to other society. For example, Western movies, fashion and lifestyle may influence local culture and reduce traditional practice in some countries. The second weakness is fail to consider other traditions and beliefs. Liberalism mainly focuses on Western ideas like individual freedom and democracy, which may not suit every society. For example, some Asian or Middle Eastern societies place greater importance on community values and religion compared to individual freedom. The third weaknesses is based on a single civilizations and rationality. This means liberalism is strongly based on Western civilization and rational thinking. Critics argue that all countries share the same historical background and or value. For example, some developing countries may prioritize stability and tradition over liberal democratic practice. Next, let's move to Marxism. The first strength is expose structural global inequality. Marxism helps explain how wealth and power are unevenly distributed in society and globally. For example, developed countries often control global markets and resources, while poorer countries continue struggling with poverty and debt. The second strength is highlight economic roots of conflict. Marxists believe many conflicts are caused by competition over wealth and resources. For example, wars over oil and natural resources can be linked to economic interests and power. So the third strike and challenge dominant realist liberal views. Marxism criticized liberalism and realism for ignoring exploitations and inequality, with focus more on workers and poorer societies. For example, Marxists argue that multinational corporations sometimes exploit cheap labor in developing countries for profits. However, Marxism also has weaknesses. The first weakness is economic reductionism. This means Marxism focuses too much on economic while ignoring culture, religion, and individual values. For example, not every social conflict happens because of money or class issues. Some conflict involve religions or ethnicity. The second weakness is state-centric despite critique. Although Marxism criticized capitalism, inequality, some Marxist governments became too dependent on state control. For example, the Soviet Union controlled many aspects of society and the economy, which limited individual freedom. The third weakness is weak on practical policy and security. Marxism is often criticized because it does not provide clear practical solutions for modern international security issues. For example, some communist economics face economic inefficiency and shortage, such as in the former Soviet Union. I will explain the strengths and weaknesses of realism. First, realism is a theory in international relations that focuses on power, national interests, and state security. Realists believe the international system is anarchy, which means there is no world government controlling all countries. Because of this, states must depend on their own power to survive and protect themselves. For example, countries strengthen their military and alliance because they cannot fully trust other states. Now, let's look at the strength of realism. The first strength is explain power politics. Clearly, realism helps us understand why countries compete for power and influence. It explains that powerful states often try to protect or expand their interests. For example, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global influence and military power, with second strength is a focus on national interests and state security. Realism emphasized that the main priority of every state is survival and security. Countries will make decisions based on what benefits and protect them the most. For example, many countries increase military spending to defend their borders and national interests. The third strength is to give a realistic view on how states behave in an anarchic international system. Realism explained that because there is no higher authority above state, countries cannot always rely on cooperation. As a result, they act carefully and prioritize self-interest. For example, countries may form alliances like NATO to protect themselves from possible threats. However, realism also has weaknesses. The first weakness is ignore cooperation between states. Realism focuses heavily on competition and conflict, but sometimes countries are able to cooperate peacefully for mutual benefits. For example, countries work together through organizations like the UN, United Nations to solve global issues such as climate change and humanitarian crises. The second weakness is give too much focus to state and not enough to international organizations. Realism sees state as the most important actors and pays less attention to organization and non-state actors. For example, organizations like the World Health Organization played an important role during the COVID-19 pandemic, showing that international organizations can also influence global affairs. The third weaknesses can be too pessimistic because it assumes conflict is always likely. Realism often assumes that conflict and war are unavoidable because states constantly compete for power and security. For example, even when countries have peaceful relationship and trade partnership, realism may still predict distrust and rivalry. In conclusion, liberalism offers an optimistic yet pragmatic framework for international relations, asserting that global politics does not have to be a permanent state of conflict. By focusing on democratic governance, economic independence, and the power of international institutions, liberalism demonstrates how states can move past the anarchy fear of war and build lasting cooperative relationships. While it faces valid criticism, particularly regarding its historical, Western bias and the reality that economic ties do not completely erase geopolitical rivalries, the theory remains a cornerstone of modern global society. Ultimately, the survival of regional bodies like ASEAN, the reliance on global trade, and the structured resolution of disputes through institutions like the UN and the WTO all prove that peace and mutual benefit are achievable through sustained cooperation.
Do you think economic interdependence between countries is more beneficial or harmful?
Hi and Assalamualaikum. My name is Natasha binti Ujang. So I will answer the first question. So I think economic interdependence is mostly beneficial because it encourages countries to cooperate rather than fight. When countries trade with each other and invest in one another's economies, they become economically connected and dependent on each other for growth, jobs, resources and technology. Because of this, wars become very costly since conflict would damage trades, businesses and economic stability for both sides. For example, the strong economic relationship between the United States and China shows how countries can still maintain trade despite political tension. However, economic interdependence also have disadvantage because it can create competitions over market, technology and global influence. This sometimes increases political tension such as trade wars and tariff between major powers. So overall, I believe economic interdependence brings more benefits than harm because it promotes economic growth and reduces the likelihood of direct conflict even though some competitions and tension may still exist. So that's all from me. Thank you.
If the liberalism promote cooperation, economic interdependence, and also the democracy, why do conflicts still happen between countries today?
My name is N4AM2384G. To answer question 2, in my opinion, conflicts still happen because countries will always prioritize their national interests, security and power. Even though liberalism encourages cooperation and peaceful relations, competition between states still exists. For example, the 2018 trade war between the United States and China happened even though both countries were economically dependent on each other. This shows economic interdependence can reduce tension, but it cannot completely prevent conflict. Another example is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where issues related to security and political interests become more important than cooperation. Therefore, although liberalism promotes peace, democracy and cooperation, conflicts still continue to happen because countries often place their own interests and national security above international cooperation.
If the world becomes too dependent on cooperation, will countries become weaker without realizing it?
Yes, cooperation between countries is a very important, but depending too much on other countries can also become dangerous. For example, during COVID-19, many countries faced shortages of medicine and medical supplies because they depended too much on import from other countries. Some countries also depend on others for oil, food, or technology. If conflicts happen, supplies may stop, and this can hurt the country's economy and security. So liberalism supports cooperation, but countries still need to be independent and able to support themselves in important areas. That's all from me.
According to liberalism, why are international organizations like the United Nations important?
That is a good question. So my answer is because they provide a place for countries to talk, share information, and solve the problems together. So without institutions, countries might not trust each other. So the UN helps reduce fear and makes cooperation easier.